I think we're live, Chris. Welcome. Thank you for hello. Thank you so much for being with us this I don't know what your weather's like, but it's really dreary Saturday morning here. How's the weather where you are?
No, it's lovely up north.
Oh, is it? So
Yeah.
Whereabouts are you? Whereabouts in the country are you?
Harrogate. It's about 10 miles north of Leeds.
Okay, perfect. I didn't do geography at school, so I'm not going to pretend I know whereabouts on the on the map that is, which sounds really awful. But you're not down in rainy Sussex, which is the main thing. So you've got the nice sunshine today, have you?
Absolutely.
Oh, bless you. Well, if we can have some back at some point, that would be really nice, because we had really nice weather for 3 days and now it's awful.
No, you can't have it. We're keeping it.
Oh, okay. So welcome, Chris. Thank you so much for giving your time to us this morning. As I have explained on the blurbs that go alongside promoting our chat today, we really want people to bear in mind that we are going to be talking about how you approach Father's Day, which obviously is a personal choice to you, and that we will be mentioning your children, your 3 beautiful children, one of which you hold in your heart, and 2 beautiful little rainbows. So we just want to kind of give a trigger warning to anyone that may find any parts of those conversations difficult. And if that's the case, please know what you personally are able to take on, and whether you want to save this video and come and look at it later, whatever's best. Everyone's individual, and grief's a very individual journey, isn't it, Chris, as we know?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really important point. You know, there's no textbook for this stuff. There's no process that everybody needs to follow. Everybody just needs to find the right way to move through this journey for themselves. And you'll get some bits of it right, and you'll get some bits of it wrong, and you'll learn and adapt as you go along. And that's completely normal.
Definitely. It's definitely a big learning journey, isn't it? And huge stumbling blocks some days, and okay days other days. You know,
and there's no time limit on that. I think that's really important to say. You know, I'm 7 years down the line now, over 7 years since Henry was born, and it's still okay to have off days with your grief. Even so, I think it's really important that people don't think, you know, I've got a couple of years to get this squared away and then people expect me to be back to normal. That people might expect that, but that's not right. No, there's no, you can, it's perfectly acceptable even after just a few days or weeks to have a good day, and then years later to be having a bad day, and that's all totally normal.
Yeah, definitely. All part of this journey, which is why we're all here, to support one another and highlight because we're all at different points in our journey, and that's really helpful for some people, you know, to know what's coming, to know that it's okay 6, 7, 8, 9, 25 years on to still have days where things are difficult. So thank you for highlighting that, Chris. So I would just like to just ask a little bit about your family, so people can really grasp where you're coming from with our chat today. Tell me a little bit about your family, your children.
So yeah, Henry's our oldest. He was born in May of 2014. Barney had a completely uncomplicated routine pregnancy. She was high risk, but there weren't any problems identified at any point. And then she had a routine midwife appointment at 37+5 a couple of days before her induction was booked for, which stopped being a routine appointment and then became a quick scan and then became a serious appointment. And yeah, we found out a couple of days before he was due to be born that he died. And I say died very deliberately. I think you talked about this on a live you did the other night, the importance of actually being clear about language. I don't buy into passed away or fell asleep or any of that kind of stuff. So, you know, when you get that close, then you have to go through the process on the same time scale that we were going through it anyway. So he was born on the 2nd of May of 2014. And then Robyn and Hallie, our little girls, were born on the 17th of December 2018. So we had a bit of a long wait before we got that rainbow happy ending. But yeah, so they just turned 2.5 now.
Oh, such a lovely age, such a lovely age. And do they get on as twins? I must ask, because I know a few twins, and and the older they get, the better they get on for some reason.
Yeah, mostly. I'm sure, you know, that obviously they have times when they are attacking each other, but I don't think that's anything to. I'm not concerned about that. You know,
No.
most of the time they're learning to be kind to each other and so on. So yeah, I think as they grow older, they'll be really close.
Sure. And do they know about Henry? Did you decide to talk to them about Henry? And if so, and also if you chose not to, what were your reasonings behind your choices?
Yeah, I mean, they will. I don't think there's any doubt in our minds for either of us that they will know about him. That as I said to you just before, they've been away for the last year or so down in Dorset during the pandemic. So we haven't had the opportunity to expose them to, you know, a trip to Henry's grave or anything like that in the same way that we might have done if they'd been up here. So they're still only. I'm very conscious that, you know, they're still only 2.5, and so I don't think we've really got to a point where we're particularly initiating conversations about it yet. But I think once they're back and that exposure becomes more obvious by virtue of the fact that they're in a position to go on a walk down to his grave and things like that, then yeah, we definitely will have those conversations, which is why I asked you the other night on the live that you did with Beyond B about the age at which you started introducing Oscar's existence to Poppy and how you did that, because I think they're coming to that kind of age now where it is going to be time to start introducing that as a reality for them. And, you know, I've got pictures of Henry up on the walls, and obviously there's pine cones scattered all around our house and so on. So it won't be something that we'll ever shy away from or hide from them.
Sure.
But that's a personal choice as well. All of these things are on this journey are personal choice. Clearly for some families, that is the way they want to address it. And that's absolutely fine too.
Definitely. So tell me about the pine cones. You mentioned pine cones. Now I've known, I connected with you through social media shortly after I lost Oscar. So you said you lost Henry in the May of 2014. I lost Oscar in the beginning of November 2014, and obviously sat up till silly o'clock scouring, researching the internet, just looking for other people that had had a lost journey too, just to connect with. And I recall very early on being very aware of your pine cones, and I've actually got a pine cone that I went on a walk and I picked up to send you, and then I just got so busy and I didn't reconnect with you and ask for your address, but I've still got that pine cone, so it's actually almost 7 years old that I've still got downstairs that I will post you one day. So tell me about your pine cones.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about, you know, that scouring the internet looking for people who've been through the same thing, because when I think for all of us when it first happens, it's no, this doesn't happen to anybody. You feel it's a very isolating experience to think that out of nowhere this has happened to you, and you don't know necessarily anybody personally that's experienced that same thing, and then when you start digging and you find out actually this is far more widespread than you thought it was, and there are people out there. I suppose everybody that kind of knows or knows of me knows the pine cone thing now, and I think it's very natural for all of us as parents to look for symbols or messages from our kids, and for a lot of parents that's butterflies or rainbows. I think it's feathers for you, isn't it?
Yes.
Well, we discovered after Henry's funeral, so about a month after he was born, we had his funeral, just over a month after he was born, and the area of the cemetery in Harrogate where the babies are buried is backed by a load of absolutely enormous pine trees.
Right.
And so every time we went down to his grave to visit him, which we're talking sort of June, July, in those very early days, the ground was just absolutely littered with pine cones. And I think it was always that thing for me that little boys just love picking up pine cones and stuffing them in their pockets and taking them places, and so that just became our thing for him, because I always had this vision that, here he was surrounded by all his pine cones that he just loved knocking about with. And I think the reason that people remember it so much is because it is relatively unique. I love all the other symbols that parents have, but I know quite a few parents for whom feathers or butterflies or rainbows are their thing. I'm yet to discover anybody else for whom pine cones is the thing. So I think it is quite unique. I suppose the other thing that I particularly liked about it and took comfort from in those early days, weeks, months, was that I think, every pine cone is unique. They're a little bit like fingerprints. They all look the same, but they're all slightly different shapes and sizes, and so that just it very quickly became a symbol for us. And I can stick them in my pockets and stash them and take them places on his behalf, if you like. And so I got a tradition early, in those early months. I referee rugby a lot of Saturdays through the winter. And so I started a tradition of visiting his grave on a Saturday morning before I'd go off to my rugby match, grabbing a pine cone, taking it with me and leaving it on the peg in the referee's room. And I suppose that, that was, for me, that was my way of taking him to my games. I'd never be able to take him to my games with me, but I could take him to my games. And so I'd always just put one on the peg above my shirt and take a photo of it before each game, and then hide it somewhere in the corner of this referee's room. And I discovered very quickly, you could find out very quickly, because you end up going back to the same rugby clubs over and over, which rugby clubs were better at cleaning up. Because some you'd go back 2 or 3 months later and there'd be no sign of this pine cone. And even now, 7 years later, I go back to some of these clubs and there's 5 or 6 pine cones stashed in various on top of the pipes and things like that. And
I love that.
And I think the nice thing about that is a lot of my mates that I referee rugby now will appear at one of these grounds and find a pine cone in the referee's room and take a photo of it and send it to me. So again,
lovely.
For a lot of us, I think the symbols lead into traditions.
Yeah.
And that's very much been the case with the pine cones. It started off as a symbol and it's now very much a tradition as well. And I've got pine cones on the wall. And
yeah, I can think that's so lovely. I have got so many goose pimples as you were talking then. I just, as a parent as well, I totally connect with that. Having symbols and them turning to traditions, and I think that would be such a lovely conversation for another live, because
absolutely,
there will be so many people that will be listening that will be thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, we do that too. And I think that's got a whole another live attached to that for another chat, and just to see what other people do as well, just out of interest. If there is another person that collects pine cones and has that lovely connection, I just love that. And I love the way that you brought it to real life, in that you said it's an interesting way to see how well they clean and tidy. That's brilliant. I love that. It's almost like yours and Henry's little trick you're playing on the caretaker, just to see how, that's brilliant. Thank you for sharing that with us. That's so lovely. So we are about, we're 13 minutes in. Blimey, that's gone quick.
We've not even started.
I know. So much to talk about. So as we know, tomorrow is Father's Day, and from a lot of our parents, we in the build up to Father's Day receive lots of messages just asking, how can people make it special? How do other people get through it? Should they acknowledge it? Should they buy the dad a Father's Day card? And it would just be really interesting just to see how Father's Day is for you, how it was for you shortly after Henry passed, and then how it is now for you with your Rainbow Girls. Would you mind just having a little chat around that? That'd be lovely.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
I think, obviously the first things to say is the first Father's Day after Henry died was 6-7 weeks after he was born, a couple of weeks after his funeral. And I think in those first couple of years, we really struggled with a lot of the sort of event holiday type of things. And, so Father's Day wasn't a thing for us. Mother's Day wasn't a thing for us. We didn't do Christmas for the first couple of years after Henry was born. And we just kind of boxed that off in terms of not wanting to aggravate our grief further. But even in even that first one in 2014, it was kind of there in the back of my mind. And I think I wrote a blog about it at 2016, maybe. Everywhere you look in the build up to Father's Day, there's stuff. And I remember, getting emails from the RFU that run rugby and from a pub chain saying, you know, here we'll do a free pint for dad if you bring the family in for lunch. And you'd walk through the supermarket and there'd be a massive dad's arrow pointing you down the aisle where all the Father's Day gifts and cards were. And so the challenge in such a commercialized society is that everywhere you look, there are reminders that this thing is coming over the hill. And in this world that we live in now, you can't even kind of shut yourself away from it at home, because you'll still get emails going, have you got the Father's Day present sorted? And that's hugely challenging. What I'm really heartened by is what we're seeing, and I'm sure you've noticed it as well in the last couple of years, a tendency from organizations. I think it started with a couple of the card companies, but it's become really quite common, a lot more commonplace now, where you'll get emails that say, we understand that X celebration day can be difficult for you. Click here if you want to opt out from emails about this. So I think it was the card chain Thoughtful, I think, were the first ones I noticed doing it. And they were really good at saying, Mother's Day is coming around the corner. We know this is difficult for some parents or some people. If you want to get out of it, here's the link. And that's important for bereaved parents. It's also, you know, potentially important for people that have just lost their parents. So that there's more than one way in which these sorts of days can be difficult. And so I'm really pleased to see that more and more companies are saying, you know what, do you want to opt out of this? Do you need to get away from this particular mail shot campaign? So that's really positive. So for the first couple of years, sorry, I've gone a bit off topic there, but
that's so true though, and so important, because some people might not know that they can opt out. So that's really a really important point to raise. Thank you.
And the more people talk about that being important to them, the more companies will pick up that that's important to people, and then the next year more companies will offer that. And you and I have been on this journey for quite a long time now, and I think whether we had gone on to have rainbow babies or not, which we both have, at 7 years we might be a little bit more protected mentally from this, and it might not be quite as emotional and as raw a thing for us. I know I could now quite happily just delete an email or not flag up of something in an aisle in the supermarket, but you know, every day, every week, every month there are new people starting out on this experience. So you know, if it is helpful to people years down, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or more years down the line, to be able to opt out of these emails, it's so important that companies hear that. Because what we're doing, whether it's through active charity work like you and I do, or whether it's just through passively feeding that back to a company as a consumer, we're preparing the ground for people that follow on this path. And there have been so many changes in the world of bereavement care and how it's provided by health professionals, and how society tackles issues surrounding death in the last 7 years. It's remarkable, really, how much it's changed over the last 7 years. I think you might agree with that, but there's still a lot to do, and all of that is driven by how the noise that people make. A lot of the changes that have been driven in terms of bereavement care have been driven by parents like you, like me, like Steph, saying, actually, there's a better way. And so whether that's, you know, actively throwing yourself into setting up a charity that trains midwives or whatever it might be, or even something all the way down that seems tiny and trivial, it's not. Every one of these things is just taking another little brick out the wall that exists around this kind of stigma and this taboo about whether or not we talk about this stuff. We've gone way off topic. The answer to your question, your original question, which I stopped talking about altogether, was for the first couple of years we just canned it. I think in 2014 we were still in that, as a society, we were still in that period of time where the vast majority of people found it a really awkward, difficult thing to talk about. What I'm seeing more is a sort of transition towards people saying, do you know what, society is more openly accepting of me talking about my child that's died. And so I feel more comfortable embracing these sorts of things from year one. But again, we'll keep coming back around to personal choice, which is that for us at that moment in time, the right thing to do for those first couple of years was to just block it out.
Sure.
But for somebody else, the right thing to do might be to say, do you know what, we're going to make a huge thing about it. We're going to have a massive day. We're going to take pine cones up into the hills and go on a walk, or whatever it might be, and really embrace it. And so again, like everything that we've been talking about, there's no right way to do this stuff, and everybody must do what feels right for them in that moment. And what feels right for you one year might not feel right for you the following year, and that's okay too.
Very, very, very true. I totally hear that. And that's something definitely that's fed back to us from parents, that their grief changes over time. So thinking about how your Father's Day has changed, or not changed since your rainbows have come along, were there any kind of traditions that came in place a couple of years down the line that you now still uphold and will continue with your girls, or how would Father's Day be now?
We've never really built any. I've never really built any traditions around Father's Day as such. So there isn't really anything that we would have done before they arrived that we would then bring through and adapt to include them. And obviously, the first Father's Day they were here, they were only 6 months old. And then the last, as I said before, the last couple last year and this year, they've been away. So we haven't really been able to embrace and celebrate that in the traditional way that being a father of living kids, whether they're rainbows or otherwise, might do. But I'm sure that in the future we'll build a tradition. I'll build a tradition with Robyn and Hallie that will find a way to incorporate Henry's life in it as well. At the moment I don't know what that is, because we haven't really had the opportunity to develop that, but I dare say by perhaps by this time next year that'll be the start of more of an established tradition with them.
Sure. And how are you feeling about tomorrow? Is there a build up for you, or are you happy to kind of let the day pass? How are you feeling about things?
Now I'm, whether this is linked to the fact that Robyn and Hallie are now here, or whether this is just the passage of time, I'm quite calm about it now. As I said, for those first few years, there was always this kind of build up, a little bit like the build up to birthdays,
sure,
where it's coming.
Yeah.
Everything is steering you towards the fact that a week on Sunday here it's going to be, and particularly more so with days like Father's Day or Mother's Day, where you can't go anywhere without seeing an end display of cards or whatever, or receiving emails. That's the build up is a lot more public for these sorts of things than it is when you've got to build up to your child's birthday, for example, because the rest of the world and the consumerist society that we live in doesn't know that it's Henry's birthday in 2 weeks, but it knows it's Father's Day. And it's bombarding you with everything that's associated with that. So certainly for the first few years, like the build up to Henry's birthday, there was always that kind of couple of weeks where there was a sort of pit in your stomach. Now it doesn't register with me in that same way anymore. For me this year, I'm just looking forward to a FaceTime with the girls tomorrow as much as anything. And a trip down if the sun stays up here and doesn't head down towards Brighton. A trip down to see Henry, take him some flowers and spend some time with him. But again, that's it. All of these things I'll keep coming back to it, and I'll keep making the point because I think it's important. It's everything about this journey is about your personal experience, and we can learn a lot from listening to other people and how they deal with their experiences and their journeys. But that doesn't mean that we have to do what they do if that doesn't feel right for us. And so it's so important to kind of keep stressing to people, figure out what's right for you, and don't overthink other people not doing the same as you, or people thinking that your decisions are strange or they wouldn't make those decisions. That's up to them as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that was going to be my next question, was going to be, do you have any advice for dads who may be facing their first Father's Day, or dads that may be awaiting their rainbows arriving, or dads in general, is there anything, I mean, that's amazing advice. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, that would maybe kind of help other fathers with some coping mechanisms to face tomorrow? I know one of the questions sent in was, it wasn't really a question, it was a statement, and it was, my advice would be just don't go near any supermarkets to save that consumer element of being kind of warmth at literally the first aisle you walk into and it's there. And that actually can just make you want to turn around and think, do you know what, I'm going to leave the cat food and fabric softener and just go home, because it's just too much. So is there anything else that you'd like to add on to everything you've said this morning, just to help?
I mean, I think that's a really sound piece of advice, and it's like we were discussing before, the consumer society that we live in doesn't know that your baby died, and so it's going to carry on going. And whilst you can opt out of email chains if you're given the opportunity to do so, you can't opt out of what displays get put up in your local supermarket. So I think it sounds weird to people that haven't been through the sorts of things that we've been through to think that you have to mentally steel yourself for going into the supermarket. For most people, that's a completely alien concept. But I think it's the same with Christmas. Sometimes you kind of have to psych yourself up, because you know what's going to hit you when you walk in, as the person that sent that comment in has described. And as long as you know what you're walking into, you can make that choice. Do I want to walk into it knowing what I'm going to find, and how am I going to cope with what I find? The supermarket was one of the things I noticed in that first couple of years, because I wasn't thinking about it, because my brain was still slightly fried with it. And you walk in because you need stuff, wine usually. And you're right. Your comment, the person's comment is right. It does just hit you. And so you develop coping mechanisms for all of these sorts of things. And that's the only way that you can do it. We develop coping mechanisms based on the experiences that we go through. And I don't just mean the experience of losing a child or your grief, just even those experiences about, I've been into the supermarket, this has hit me like a ton of bricks. How am I going to cope with this the next time? Or how am I going to adapt how I handle situations to allow me to cope with this, or opt out of it next time? Do I have any other advice? I suppose the biggest piece of advice that I've got, and without detracting anything from what I've been saying about how everything's personal and everybody must do what's right for them, I think the biggest piece of advice I've got for other dads out there, and this is relevant to Father's Day, but I think it's also relevant in a much broader sense, which is, don't bottle it up, and don't try and do what we're meant to do as blokes and just drive through these things. I think talking and being open about how you're feeling is so important. For 2 or 3 years after Henry died, I didn't do that. I bottled up, and I just pushed through, and I sort of threw myself into work and tried to distract myself from my grief. And the reason why men do that is there's a couple of elements to it. The first is that society is not very good at understanding how men deal with emotion, and it's not very understanding and capable at facilitating and helping men be open about their emotions. We live in a very toxic masculine patriarchal society that says, as men, we're not meant to show emotion, nobody wants to hear how we're feeling, blokes don't cry, and all that kind of stuff. And it's just not true. But the reason that people, as blokes, why we do bottle it up is because it works. We are trained not to talk about our feelings. So if we don't talk about our feelings, nobody asks us about our feelings. And then we don't have to have the difficult conversations about our feelings because nobody's asking us about our feelings. And so we get to just carry on going. And so we push through. And what that allows us to do is keep pushing through. And so we convince ourselves that actually that's working. But under the surface, it's not. Under the surface, all that's happening is we're just kicking that problem down the road, and it's just building up and building it up, and you know, one of my friends, David, I'm sure you know David already. David's daughter Grace was stillborn the same night as Henry. They were sort of 3 hours apart. We didn't know each other before. That would be a really weird coincidence if we were mates before that happened. We've become hugely close friends, having made that connection on the back of this shared experience, like you and I have, like lots of us have. Yeah. And we've become particularly close because we recognize that we've been on that same journey for exactly the same length of time, give or take 3 hours. And he's now Hallie's godfather. And I think there's a lot to be said for how close the friendships and the connections that you make through this shared experience can be, that we've gone from complete strangers whose kids died the same night to godparents to each other's kids in the space of 3 or 4 years. But he talks very much about, you know, that it will find a way out. Your grief as a man will find a way out if you don't address it. He talks a lot about, you know, walking down the street one day and just out of the blue, just punching one of those green broadband boxes on the pavement, just because it was bottled up and just out of nowhere it just came out. And so in the context of Father's Day, I think it's really important that you are able to, if you choose to, and I would encourage people to, share your thoughts and feelings about how you're feeling about the day. But I think that same concept extends to in a broader sense as well, which is we don't actually serve anybody any purpose by bottling up as men. And so I'm a big advocate for, I know there are lots of dad support groups out there and things like, and I think that's really important, that because I don't know about anybody else that's listening, that the solution for a lot of my male friends was, should we go down the pub and watch sport? And therefore we can play pool or we can watch the rugby, and I don't have to ask you how you're coping with the death of your child, but we're in the pub and we're hanging out, and so everything must be fine. So I think it is really important that there are dad support groups and Sands United football teams and all these sorts of things that I was bringing up. But I also think it's really important that couples don't find themselves grieving independently of each other. And I sometimes think this push to set up dad support groups and dad sports teams and things like that, there is a danger that it goes too far the other way, and it says mums get to grieve here and dads grieve over there, and they don't grieve together. And I think it is important that dads have an outlet for male grief in a male environment, but I don't think that should detract from the importance of couples keeping open their lines of communication and talking to each other about how they're feeling, because they will grieve at different speeds and in different ways. And if they aren't grieving at the same speed or in the same way as their partner, whether that's the man or the woman, they will sometimes then struggle to understand why their partner isn't grieving openly or to the same extent that they do. And there is the possibility for that to create a rift. So I think it is so important that whether it's Father's Day or more broadly, particularly with your partner, but also with those closest friends and family around you, that you are able to just talk openly about how you're feeling at any given moment, whether that's about Father's Day or the broader issue of the fact that your baby died, because this is a huge thing. I don't think there is a single life event that is worse for a parent than the death of their child, bar none. So yeah, I think that being willing to, or for the people around you to create an environment where you feel comfortable talking and sharing how you're feeling, and that's a really uncomfortable thing for a lot of men. It was a very uncomfortable thing for me, and I suppose I'm a chronic oversharer now. I don't care anymore. If I'm finding things difficult, then I will tell the people, my nearest and dearest around me, because they need to know. People can't support you if they don't know what's going on in your head.
Yeah, totally. That is such important information to bring to the forefront of people's minds, and to give permission to dads to feel it's okay, because like you say, society doesn't portray that as a whole, and it's really important that we create those spaces for that to happen.
And I think the thing for me with that is, you know, society isn't good at male emotion at all, in any context, whether that's the death of a parent, the breakdown of a marriage, the death of a child, or anything. Our society is predisposed to men going, no, I'm fine, off we go. And blokes don't talk about their emotions because society has trained them not to. And I think that is changing. That wheel is turning now, but it's still not turning fast enough, and it still hasn't turned far enough. But the other thing that our society is, in this context, the context of our conversation, that adds on top of the fact that it's no good at talking about male emotion, is our society is really, but you talked about this the other night, our society is really bad at talking about death. In any context, but is particularly bad at talking about the death of a baby. And the reason our society is so bad at talking about the death of a baby is because it takes the people who aren't going through it so far out of their comfort zone that the easiest thing for them to do is to not talk about it, because then they don't feel uncomfortable. And so it's easier for that person to go down a different aisle in the supermarket to avoid Gemma, or cross the road to avoid having a conversation with Chris, than it is to tackle their own discomfort. And it's a bit back to front, because people, I've heard it and you've heard, I didn't mention it because I thought I'd upset you. And the answer is, well, you didn't not mention it because you thought you'd upset me, because I'm already upset. My baby died. You didn't mention it because you thought you'd upset yourself, and therefore you didn't want to feel uncomfortable for 15 minutes, so you protected yourself. But in doing so, what you've done is you've protected yourself from feeling a bit uncomfortable by isolating me. And when you add the inabilities for men to show their emotions and talk about their feelings to the way that society deals with the death of babies, when you put those two things together, you've created an environment where society doesn't know how to let blokes talk about this life-changing, earth-shattering experience. And the only way that society will get better at knowing how to support blokes talking about their feelings is by blokes actually saying, do you know what? I am going to talk about this, and you may feel uncomfortable the first time I talk about it, and you may feel uncomfortable the second time I talk about it, but by the third time you may just embrace the fact that I've given you a pine cone and we're having a conversation about Henry, or that we felt we were out playing football and a white feather landed on the pitch and we had a conversation about Oscar, or whatever it might be. We only break down those stigmas and those taboos by saying, actually, no, I'm not having that. That doesn't work for me anymore. As a parent, that doesn't work for me, so I'm changing it.
Yeah, totally. And that's so important, so important. And those conversations can only happen when we feel strong enough as parents to speak out, to tackle that and go, actually, like you say, this isn't working for me, and I am going to talk. Whether you want to listen or not, I'm going to tell you. And I can't thank you enough for your time today, because just being able to hear your experience will really, really go a long way in helping dads and mums that will be watching this, and partners and family members, to connect and remember to ask those important questions. You know, how do you want us to tackle Father's Day tomorrow? Do you want us to celebrate it? What would you like? You're the father. What would you like? And I know a lot of people have come forward and said that it will be their first Father's Day and they're not sure what they want. They don't know, and that's okay too.
That's fine too.
It's totally fine to not know what you want. And just see how the day goes, you know.
And actually, you know what? Particularly in your first Father's Day, but in any Father's Day, but certainly particularly in your first one, what you want the day before, or what you want when you get up at 8 o'clock in the morning, might be very different to what you want by 3 in the afternoon. And that's okay too. Everything about this journey is about working out what your path looks like. And there is no straight line from A to B on grief. Anybody that looks at those psychology plans and paths about how grief works and says that grief starts here and follows down a process and ends here and then you're fixed, it doesn't work like that. And so the journey of grief is full of twists and turns and steps backwards and steps sideways and steps forward and big loops. And some of those twists and turns take place in the space of a single day, and some of them are more gentle and take place over a period of weeks or months, and that's all totally normal. So guys shouldn't be phased tomorrow if they find that at 9 o'clock in the morning they're dreading this day and they feel awful, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon they feel okay, or the other way around, that they felt okay but by 3 o'clock in the afternoon they've been into the supermarket and it's hit them like a ton of bricks. All of these things are totally normal. There's no normal for this. This whole experience for us as parents is so completely abnormal that there is no default setting. There is no what works for me might not work for you and might work for somebody else. The only thing that's normal is the absence of the fact that there is no normal. Everybody's journey is so unique that you just work out what works for you and have conversations with your partners and reach out to other dads. There are a number of us now that there weren't. I think in 2014 there were. I don't think there were any. I think really I can think of. And I think there are now other dads that are actually very open on social media about their experiences with the death of their child, that if you fire out messages on Instagram, they will reply to them. And I don't think that's just a dad thing. I think there are lots of fantastic mums doing the same. But the nice thing about what's happened, I don't know whether you found this in 2014 when Henry and when Oscar died, there wasn't really that ability to connect instantaneously with other people. We were in the dying days of chat forums and message boards, and so you could connect with people, but you had to register and wait to be approved by an admin, and then you could get stuck into Harrogate 243 or whatever, and you could have those conversations, but you weren't really having conversations with a real person that you could kind of connect with in the same way. And then it kind of diverted into sort of Facebook groups and things like that. And you could join a group, but it was always behind a firewall. And obviously Facebook's always been about, are you friends with somebody before you can really have a conversation with them? Certainly back then it was. It's adapted. And then Instagram came along, and now you can follow or connect with anybody immediately, and you can be firing off messages to somebody that you've never met, that somebody said, oh, there's a dad out there who's got an Instagram account, and you can just message that. And so that ability to have an immediate conversation with somebody who knows what you're going through exists now in a way that when Henry and Oscar died, it just didn't exist. And I suppose social media does get a bad press sometimes, but I think one thing that's been hugely positive about the way that social media has developed in the last few years is that instantaneous ability for bereaved parents to connect with each other. It's a pretty niche positive about the internet, but from a bereaved parent's point of view, certainly that fact that people can just fire off a message out of nowhere and say, I hope you don't mind me messaging, but can I just ask? And people will reply. Those of us that are out there sharing our experiences publicly, like you and I, wouldn't do that if we weren't willing to respond to people who reached out to us on the back of it. If we weren't willing to have those conversations, we wouldn't put ourselves out there.
No, definitely. So if people did feel they needed to reach out to you and they've watched this and they feel they'd really like to just ask some further questions or get some advice, how can they get in contact with you, Chris?
Instagram probably is the best way, to be honest. I don't know whether you can add my Instagram handle to the post or anything like that, but that's the most instantaneous way, and obviously it does just come through. And my Instagram inbox is always open to dads who are finding things difficult or just want to chat about their experiences. That's why you and I do the sorts of things that we do.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Chris. I would love to add your Twitter handle to this post. That would be amazing. We'll share it over our social media today. But thank you so much for your time. Honestly, it's been so insightful. And as a mum, it's so interesting to hear a dad talking so openly. And I can't thank you enough. So thank you so much for your time today. And I do hope the weather holds out so you do get a lovely afternoon down with Henry tomorrow and a lovely FaceTime with your girls.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. So here's the awkward moment where I end the live and we both sit grinning at the screen. So apologies to anyone that sees us sitting here with like a Cheshire cat. But thank you again, Chris, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. Take care.